Matthew says. This may be the last one after I get through. I'll try to keep it clean, all right? Okay. I thought I would start off with a quiz show. And there's a quotation from Job, and in a few minutes you'll see why that's likely to be up there. But I thought you might like to engage in a quiz show here. You might like game shows. So we're going to play a little game to get started. What is my major? And let's see if any of you can guess what I should major in. Now we've got to start somewhere, so we'll start where I started. Imagine that you are the chemistry advisor and I show up in your office and tell you I'm a chemistry major. What would you do? I forgot to bring the beautiful golf sculpture, but I'll get it if any of you win it. It's a beautiful thing I was given that I can't seem to get. That anybody would want.
Now, do you mean what would we do back then, or what would we do now when we have?
What would you do now? I wonder in your office. You're the advisor. I wonder in your office. I'm a chemistry major.
Have to get your transcript.
Okay.
I advise you to put you in classes.
Okay.
I would send you to ESS,
What is that?
exercise science.
Oh, okay. Well, why in the world am I in college anyway? Would any of you ask that question?
What do you want to do?
I want to be an auto mechanic, but my parents won't send me to auto mechanic school, which is the correct answer. Plus, I'm trying to stay out of the draft. So that is why I'm in college. Next question.
Why chemistry then?
All right, I'll answer that honestly, but now back then I probably would not have. In fact, I think I knew the answer, but I probably wouldn't have told you. But if I knew you well, I probably would have told you. I'm a pyromaniac. I like explosions. I don't like people, and this is a way to hurt them and get power over them, and so that is why I'm a chemistry major.
Ever hear about that one?
Major in physics. Next question.
You don't like people?
Oh, I hated people. That was basically my school experience. I had what is basically the problem of evil transferred to humans. I did not like adults at all because if adults cared anything for me, they would never have sent me to school. And as far as I was concerned, that was airtight logic. Nobody cared anything about me would have made me go to school. So I disliked human beings, adults at least, very, very strongly. I was very antisocial, very introverted. Now what would you do?
Call security.
Might have been a good idea.
Put you in Dr. Blasingham's classes.
Well, I think you've learned enough to know I came into college really messed up. Let me tell you a few other things. I was absolutely convinced I was going to hell, and I had to reconcile myself to that. I grew up in a very legalistic church, and I'd heard preachers say a bunch of things that were wrong, and I did them all. They said it was adultery if you lusted after women, and I lusted after every woman I saw nearly that was my age, and I couldn't seem to stop. I smoked, I cursed, I drank, all of which was, of course, going to send me to the bad place. So I entered college as a very, very lost duck, and I'm mentioning this just to say, if somebody shows up in your office and says they want to major in something, I'd suggest you assume they don't know what they're talking about. I'd suggest that you consider the possibility they may be very messed up psychologically and emotionally. They may need a lot of help with socialization. They really need an adult mentor. Most of my adult life I have suffered because I never had an adult mentor. I never had anyone that was friendly who would give me some good advice. And so I hope that you won't simply advise students. I hope you will try to be their friend, their confidant, their mentor. Find out what they're thinking. Find out what's going on with them. find out what their school experience was. If you had found out some of my school experiences or earlier experiences, you'd have had a lot better idea of what I probably should be doing. Let me just give you a couple examples. I believe I was in the 3rd grade, and we were reading The Stupidest Reader I Ever Saw. You just almost had to beat me to make me read it. It was something about Spot saw a dog, or a dog. No, Spot was the dog. Bill saw Spot, or some idiot thing that I hated. Our school would let you go to the library, though. We had a deal where we had 2 grades in one room, and so when the teacher was teaching the other grade, we could go to the library and get a book and check it out. So I went in the library and was messing around, and I found an absolutely wonderful book. Oh, I snuck it in. You know, I would read it when I was supposed to be doing my spelling and get in trouble with the teacher. Wonderful book. Most interesting book I ever read, and it was years before I read one that was that interesting. It was the Iliad. And I discovered something that I'm still interested in. Greek and war. Neither of which my teacher even considered. I also had some other rather interesting ideas. When I was about 8, we were driving to Texas to visit my grandparents, and I began to worry about something. We passed some pine trees. I remember this moment very well. We passed a stand of large pine trees, and on the other side of it was a house. And of course, you couldn't see the house until you got past the pine trees. And I began to wonder if that house was there before you could see it. And I began to wonder, how would you know? And it occurred to me that there wasn't any way to know. There was no way to know that house was there before you saw it. And of course, you could ask other people, but who knows if they're telling you the truth? Well, you'll recognize, I think, those of you in humanities at least, what am I doing? I'm into a philosophical problem that is known as solipsism. And sooner or later, most people, that occurs to them, but they don't worry about it. Well, it worried me. And so even at 8, you can see I have a very philosophic turn of mind. Well, anyway, this is probably not what you're interested in. Let's see how it all turned out. I've got a quote there that I thought you might like to see. But I went on. I entered Harding in 1955, majoring in chemistry, even though I had no idea why. In 1956, I believe that's the date, I took a Cooter preference test. That's supposed to tell you what you're interested in, right? What you need to major in, what you need to do. When I got to the end of mine and looked over to see, it said, "You have not answered these questions honestly." Well, now you'd think a counselor would catch that and do something to help me, because obviously I'm lost. But they didn't. They just said, "Here's your results, you know. Go enjoy them." And of course, I was very upset because it called me a liar. I went on. I didn't like math. I thought I didn't like math. Really, I had never had any very good math. And in 1956, I enrolled in calculus, very much not wanting to, thinking I would hate it. And you know what I discovered? Calculus is fascinating. Really, really interesting. Now, since I'd hated actually arithmetic and what little math I'd had all my life, that would be a shock. Loved calculus. Met Lynn in 1957. In the summer of 1958, I took psychology during the summer. And the teacher, they had a standardized final that determined most of your grade. And the teacher said, "This test has been taken by thousands of students. It's been standardized. And so there is about a 0 chance that any of you will score any higher on this test that has already been made." Well, if you know me, that's just a red flag. And so I studied my head off and made the highest grade that had ever been made. So they had to re-standardize their test, which I thought was hilarious. I also love psychology, and so I'm a junior fixing to go into my senior year in chemistry, and I suddenly discover I love psychology. Now what do you do? Well, I went on and majored in chemistry. I also qualified in math, so I could have taken a Bachelor of Science in either one. I took the GRE in both fields and made higher in chemistry, so I went to graduate school in chemistry. But I came that close to being a math major. Went to LSU in 1959 and graduate school in chemistry. Got married June the 4th, 1960 to my present sweet wife. And she began to study biochemistry at LSU, and I was majoring in chemistry. I believe it was 1962, and that's a little foggy, but I think that's the date. I had an argument about a fella about the meaning of baptizo, baptism. And we had a big argument. And he said, well, I know what it means because I know Greek, and you don't. Well, again, that's a red flag. You know, anybody tell me I can't do something, I am ready to fight them. And that is the way I used to try to motivate students, because that's what motivates me, and we all have to learn better than this, I think. But I'd go into chemistry class, I'd say, well, most of you won't pass this class. Well, to me, that would be, I'd say, oh, yeah, I'll show you, buddy. And I discovered most of the students went out and dropped the class. And so I had to learn that's not the way to motivate most people, but it motivates me. So when he told me I didn't know the Greek word, guess what? Next time I saw a Greek book in a bookstore, I bought it and started studying Greek. And I have studied it pretty regular, almost every day. I'm not sure I've missed any days. I guess I have when I was sick. But anyway, that got me studying Greek. And then in 1963, I finished a PhD at LSU. My first job was at Oklahoma Christian College, it was back then. And I got there and discovered I was supposed to share an office with a fellow named Eugene Bailey, who was a chemistry teacher. I hope I've spelled his last name right. I think that's correct. But he was the chemistry teacher, and I was supposed to share an office with him, and the office was about as big as this closet. A little bit bigger. That's about how much room I had, because it was a small office and we had to share it. And he didn't like the idea, and I didn't like the idea. And the ironic thing is we became very, very good friends. And Eugene Bailey was the first person that gave me very much of a whiff of grace, because Eugene Bailey had left legalism and had gone off into more of a grace-oriented Christianity, and he got me thinking that way. I did not like OCC. I did not like Oklahoma City. I did not like Oklahoma, and I left after 1 year, and I went to the University of Arkansas in Little Rock at the Graduate Institute of Technology, and worked on a postdoc for a couple of years. And I was studying, basically doing gas chromatographic analysis of amino acids and sugars, and of course they're not volatile, so they have to be derivatized, and I was doing that. When I left the University of Arkansas on a postdoctoral, I went to Arkansas State University in Jonesboro and began to teach chemistry there as an assistant professor. And somewhere in there, I didn't mention, the Graduate Institute was just a few blocks away from a bookstore. And that bookstore had a large selection of philosophy and theology books. And one of my favorite things was to walk down to that bookstore, buy a book, even though we didn't have much money. And I read a lot of philosophy, theology, really got interested in it. And then, after I got to ASU, I discovered Søren Kierkegaard. And this is the way I do things. This is me. I got so much into Kierkegaard that I seriously considered studying Danish, so that I could read his works in the original language. Now that's just kind of the way I do things, I guess. It's crazy, but you know, and during all this time I'm not so sure I'm a chemist. I just can't stay concentrated with chemistry. I enjoy doing it for a while, but after a while I'm off into philosophy, or I'm off into playing basketball, or Susan's probably got it right. I probably should have majored in exercise science. She's probably got it right. In fact, you probably would have come a lot closer to understanding me if you had just asked, when I came to you to enter college, what do you do in your spare time? What do you do in your spare time? Well, if I had answered that honestly and told you what I do in my spare time, you would have wondered what in the world is he doing in college? Because the things that I would spend hours doing was two things. One is I had a huge garden, about as big as this room, that I took care of. I started doing it in high school, and I didn't realize that this is unusual, but I took care of a garden nearly all the way through high school and all the way through college. I had my garden at home. And the other thing I did for hours and hours and hours was, Lynn knows,
Batting rocks.
bat rocks. Bat rocks. Well, guess what I did yesterday morning? I batted rocks. The only thing is, they're little white ones now. And I've got some very expensive sticks that I hit them with. But you know, we don't change that much, and I think that's one thing that I'm having to reconcile myself to because I feel very guilty. I grew up in a legalistic church, and would God want you to spend hours batting rocks? Well, the answer to that is, of course not. A waste of time. So I don't know, maybe I should have gone to school, majored in agriculture. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. But anyway, during the summer, Arkansas State didn't have anything for me to do during the summer, so during the summer I went to Pierce Chemical and did synthetic chemistry. I synthesized compounds for them. And I found something that I was very, very, very good at. It's just right up my alley. It's practical. The quicker you do it, the better. And I had already synthesized some of these compounds anyway, and all I had to do was synthesize them, write it out so that some guy that hadn't finished high school could do it, because that's who did their syntheses, and write the QC, the quality control for it, and put it on the market. And although I worked for them only about six months or so, I probably brought 60 compounds on the market. I probably made millions of dollars for Pierce Chemical. And the last time I was there, the president called me in and wanted me to stay. And I'd already promised Dr. Maddox I was coming here. And but he wanted me to stay at Pierce Chemical. And he said, "Well, why won't you stay?" I said, "Well, I don't think I'm suited for this." And he said, "Well, you sit down and name your salary, and we'll pay you anything you want if you'll stay here." Well, that was a little tempting. I said, "Well, I've already promised a guy I'm going to Lubbock Christian." Well, he couldn't believe. He said, "Well, what's Lubbock Christian going to pay you?" And I did not want to tell him. I was turning down a salary back. This was 1969. Actually, I think it was the summer of 1968, I think, if I remember right, but I'm not sure now. But, no, that is right. It was 1968, summer of 1968. You know, I was turning down a salary. He said, "Name any figure you want." I could have, well, $10,000 a month. And he could not believe I was turning that down to come teach at a school for $300 a month. But that's what I did. I just didn't think I was going to work out at Pierce Chemical, even though I was doing awfully well. 8 to 5 jobs, it just chafed me. I wanted to study my Greek. I had my Greek book at my desk, and every day, 12 o'clock, as soon as the lunch break, I thought it was, you know, okay. Still kind of legalistic. 12 o'clock, sit down, pull out my Greek book, study till 1, eat some lunch, slam the door shut, and go back to work. And then I discovered boomerangs during this time, and there was a nice field next to Pierce Chemical, and so sometimes during the lunch hour I'd go out and throw a boomerang for an hour. And it fascinated me. It still does. I had a very good, expensive one I bought. Well, anyway, I came to came to Lubbock Christian. Of course, it was Lubbock Christian College back then in the summer of 1969. I hadn't even been here to look at the department. Dr. Maddox said, "I want you to come out here and I want you to build a really good chemistry department." Well, I was kind of an industrial chemist. That's kind of the way I thought. That was what my training was. And so I thought, well, you know, we want a good chemistry department to turn out people to work in industry. And I just assumed that, you know, well, they have 2 years of chemistry, so they've got, you know, what you need for 2 years of chemistry. I got out here and discovered we had nothing. Oh, and they had increased my salary time I came here. Dr. Maddox, I called him and said, "I don't think we can live on $300 a month." And so he said, well, the board just met and approved a raise, so you take your contract, mark out the 300 and write in 400. And I thought, well, I'll just write it 800. But I was a little too honest. But anyway, I came out here, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. In the first place, I discovered I was going to have to teach physics, which wasn't too bad because I already had 12 graduate hours in physics, so that wasn't too bad. But so I said, well, where's the physics lab? I asked one of the people teaching agriculture. May have been Glenn Davis, who was here during that time. He said, well, I don't know. I don't know where they teach physics. I said, well, where's the lab? Well, I've never seen a lab. Well, where's the equipment? I've never seen any physics equipment. Well, I started hunting it, so I just started going through. We had an old yellow barracks building right over here that we were teaching in. So I started looking for the physics equipment. Well, I finally found it back in the back of a closet. It was one piece of equipment. It was a linear thermal expansion, a device to measure linear thermal expansion. And so it's good for maybe one experiment. And I got to come up with 30 experiments during the 2 semesters. And so I thought, what in the world? And then the chemistry was just about as bad. They had very little. The still to make distilled water did not work. And so I asked the chemistry teacher, who was Walter Bostic, who was a former petroleum engineer or chemical engineer. I'm not sure which his field was, but he worked for Esso, which is now Exxon. And he was teaching chemistry here. He'd retired from Esso, and he was teaching chemistry. And I said, well, where's the distilled water? Well, the still doesn't work. They had one, but it didn't work. It was all rusted out. I said, well, what do you do for distilled water? Well, they caught rainwater in a barrel in the back of the chemistry building. So I went back there and looked, and sure enough, they had a big rain barrel and caught water if it ever rained. And I looked in there, and it was full of this green stuff that grows in water, algae. And if you're careful, you could scoop off some water off the top. And they weren't doing anything for labs. Now, Walter Bostic was a wonderful Christian man, but he was not doing anything for chemistry lab. He had a lab assistant, and what they would do is they would meet for lab, and he would give out a paper in which you did balance some redox equations. Now, I don't know why, well, he didn't have a doctorate. Mr. Bostic loved redox equations. He thought that was chemistry. And so every time they had lab, they would balance redox equations. And that was lab. And I said, well, don't they have some glassware or something? Well, yeah, we've got some. It's in the storeroom, most of it. So I went and looked, and what they had done, they had a large sink, and every time they would use a piece of glassware, they would simply put it in the sink and leave it and run water on it. And so it was a big sink, and so you have this huge sink full of glassware which had hard water all over it that you had to soak it in acid to get off. And I started trying to clean up that stuff, and it was a mess. It was a mess. But anyway, I developed a chemistry program curriculum, and chemistry is pretty cut and dried, so this was not any problem. We had an accreditation in 1971, and they axed the chemistry program, basically. Dr. Maddox wanted a good chemistry program, so I came here and developed what I hoped would be an American Chemical Society approved program, which was 45 hours. And that is what was recognized as a chemistry degree by the American Chemical Society. And if you have 45 hours of chemistry, you can go to graduate school anywhere without any problems. You don't have to take any makeup classes. Well, these guys came here and said, you are a liberal arts college, you cannot offer a technical chemistry degree. So they cut us back, made us cut back to 36 hours, which is what I tried to get in graduate school with, and had to take 2 semesters of remedial classes. And so I went in basically a year behind people that had a approved chemistry program. So we had to drop that, and of course this is they're so desperate, I guess, for chemistry students now that they'll pretty well take our students. But the first few years, we had a really bad time getting students in. They had a hard time. They had to take all this make-up work. They did not do well on entrance exams. Basically, they were missing the last year of chemistry. And so we had a rough time. The chemistry building, the science building, was built, of course. We moved into it in 1971, if I remember correct. Dr. Maddox said he had $1 million grant to build that building, and we could not go over, and so we built some good laboratories. We did not have the money for classrooms, so that building had no classrooms. And I complained about it to Dr. Maddox, and he said, well, you can just use other classrooms on the campus. It'll work out okay. So that's what we did. John Hay Jr., who at that time was the chairman of biology, and myself pretty well designed the building we have. And we watched its construction very carefully. And I found out something. The plumber saw he was going to lose money on his bid, and so he started cutting corners. And so if they ever build a building that you're going to use, you better keep an eye on it, because I found out if they realize they're losing money, there's no telling what they'll do. And we caught a lot of things. We did not catch a shower drain. And so if you go look in the organic lab, the general chemistry lab, you will see we have a shower and no drain. So if you're in there, don't get acid in your eyes, because if you do, I'm not going to let you run we don't have a place to put that water. Anyway, we didn't have any classrooms, and so I was using mainly some rooms over in the CDC. One year, I had a periodic table up. You can't teach chemistry very well without a periodic table. And so I had a large periodic table. They're kind of expensive. And I had that up in the room. And students who were in there at night practicing for master follies tore it up. Just shredded it. I don't know what they did, but they tore it completely up. And it made me so mad that I decided we've got to have a classroom. And so I turned our general chemistry lab, I believe if I remember the date, it was 1987. If I remember the date correctly, I turned our general chemistry lab into a classroom. And we are still using it for a classroom. And that made us very cramped for lab space, but at least we have a classroom. It turned out to be too big, and so just a year or two later, we decided to make part of it a computer room, which computers were new things. And Lynn was back in school studying computer applications, and so she designed and helped build our computer lab, which we still use. And it's probably not big enough, but it's still in use. So we had a classroom for the first time. And then about I'm a little fuzzy on the date here, but about 1989, Harvey Pruitt caught me and said that the fellow that was running our water research, we'd gotten a big grant, as most of you know, from the federal government to do research on land application of wastewater. Blair Leftwich was running that, and he decided he wanted to turn it into a lab for himself. And so he offered to buy all of the equipment from LCU for $8 million. And Harvey Pruitt said, I don't think that's enough money. We have turned him down, and so he's going to move out. And said, well, you go over there and run our water laboratory. And I said, well, I guess so. So I went over there expecting to see a lab that was worth more than $8 million, and I went over there and looked around and realized that if you gave somebody $1 million for it, it'd be plenty. They had a bunch of stuff that was left. Well, it was not worth much. And so I was wishing that they had taken that $8 million. But they didn't, and so I tried to run the lab, and that is the hardest I've ever worked in my life at a job. Because we tried to keep that lab running, and of course Blair had moved out. He'd taken the people with him that knew how to run the lab. He had taken the instructions to run the machinery. And so, I just walked in cold. Here's a bunch of machines, some of which I'd never used in my life. No employees. And somehow we got to keep this thing going. And we had one or two employees that had stayed, that had not gone with Blair. And so I got them, and we just rolled up our sleeves and started trying to do analytical chemistry with what we had. And a lot of the stuff I'd never done in my life. We had to order a bunch of stuff just even to tell us what the tests were. We got things going pretty well for a while. One of the big tests that we had to do was BTEX. And this was back during the time when the state government, the government of Texas, had registered all the underground petroleum tanks. And they had set aside money. I think they're very wise in this. This is one of the best state programs I think I've ever seen, because instead of simply mandating something, I think they did it right. That's my opinion. But if you had an underground petroleum tank of any sort, gasoline, diesel, anything that was petroleum, you had to register it with the state. And then the state passed a law that you had to test it to see if it was leaking. And they had enough foresight to set aside a lot of money, and so they would pay for the tests. And so all of a sudden, you've got a tremendous demand for chemistry and environmental laboratories to test for underground petroleum leakage. And so one of the things you would test for was BTEX. Now that stands for the common aromatic hydrocarbons that are very toxic. Benzene, BTEX. Benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene. And so you test for those. Well, we had a way of doing that using an infrared spectroscoph, and we had one, and I was doing most of it, and I figured out how to do it pretty well. And so we were doing BTEX. Well, the EPA came out and said, no, you can't do it that way. You got to do it with a gas chromatograph that has a mass spectrophotometer. Well, we had one of those, but it was horrible to run. This was back in the early days of computers. The computer wouldn't work half the time, and if the computer worked, the GC, the gas chromatograph, wouldn't work, and if it worked, the mass detector wouldn't work. And the instruction manuals, I mean, they had a whole row of instruction manuals. You'd need a PhD just to run that thing. And we had a guy that was trying to learn to run it, but he never did figure it out. And that really axed our program pretty much. And so they finally gave up and closed our water research, and I was left without a job. The school was kind enough to let me teach math for a while, and so I went back to Tech and took enough graduate hours in math that I could teach math. And so I did for a while, and then our physics teacher retired, and so I ended up teaching physics. And of course, during that time, I wasn't teaching in my field. And so when I was teaching math, I thought, well, this is a good time to do something I've always wanted to do. And so I went back to Tech, and I got a degree in counseling. I was going to do counseling. And you remember I was interested in psychology way back in college. And I'd continued to be interested in it, so I thought, I'll just get a degree in counseling. I'll be a counselor since I don't have a job in my field. And so I got a degree in counseling. It's actually a Master's of Education from Tech in 1997. And I was going to graduate in 1997, and so of course I got to get licensed, and you have to do a whole bunch of practicum and type work and whatnot. But I was planning to do that, and so I actually had the surgery during spring break. So it had been in March before I graduated in May. Blood was detected in my urine when I went in for a checkup. And so my general practitioner made me go in for a x-ray of my kidneys. So I went in and had an x-ray, and the radiologist came in and said, well, we've got an x-ray of you, and we think we want you to have a sonogram. I thought, oh my goodness, they found something. So I went in with about 100 pregnant women and sat and waited till I had a sonogram. And the guy comes in and says, well, we got a nice sonogram on you. We think we want you to have a CAT scan. And I thought, oh my goodness, what have they found? So I went in and had a CAT scan, and my doctor called me in that I'd been sent to a kidney specialist. He called me in and said, well, you have kidney cancer. And he showed me this CAT scan, and in my right kidney there is a thing probably about that big, I would guess, a growth. And then he showed me my left kidney, and I got the same thing, except they're smaller. And so he said, you got kidney cancer in like 99%. And I said, well, what's the treatment? Radiation, chemo, what do you do? And he said, well, we don't have any chemo or radiation that will work for kidney cancer. I thought, oh, that's great news. No treatment. So I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, the safest thing is just take out that kidney. And that was on Monday, and the next Thursday I went in and my right kidney was removed. And so I was lying in the hospital recovering from this. And when I came to, the doctor was on the telephone in my room arguing with the pathologist. The pathologist said it was not malignant, and my doctor said it was. And they were arguing. And I remember, even though I was groggy, I remember the doctor saying, well, I never saw a case like this when it wasn't malignant. And I don't know what the pathologist said. He's on the other end of it. But anyway, they argued about it, and after a while, they finally decided they'd send it off to Dallas. And so they did. So my kidney's off in Dallas somewhere if I ever want it again. But anyway, I never heard any more about it, so I figured, oh, well, they'll tell me. So for several years, I had to have a sonogram of my left kidney every few months to see if it was growing, and apparently it was not, and so finally they just gave up, and so here I am. But because of that, I couldn't do anything about insurance, and so I needed to stay on an insurance program, and so I just kept teaching physics, and here I am. And finally, I think it was 2008, I finally retired. I'm not sure why now. What is my major? I'm still trying to figure it out. You know, some of us just can't seem to settle on a major. And what do you do with us poor folks? We just don't fit anywhere. So what I love is Greek, theology, physics, mathematics, history. I, of course, was my first year out of graduate school when President Kennedy was assassinated. I've been fascinated ever since trying to figure out who did it. And if you follow that, you know the government began to release documents in the year 2000, which pretty well clarifies all of that. A number of books have been published now, so if you'd like to know who was behind the Kennedy assassination, that's pretty well known now. World War II fascinates me. Again, they released documents in recent years that illustrate or show clearly that President Roosevelt knew exactly what Japan was going to do. Gardening, I still love gardening. If it would rain, I'd probably plant a garden. I don't know it. But anyway, that's what I'm doing, and that's me, and I'm still lost. So if any of you know what I should major in, please give me some advice. Okay.
You forgot golf.
Oh, is golf up there?
No, you forgot to do golf.
Oh.
Y'all really love golf.
Well, golf isn't a field of study.
Well, Perry, as usual, I'll ask the first couple of questions. You said that when you arrived at Harding, you hated school. So what happened that made you decide to go to graduate school?
Well, I discovered some things I liked, and one was calculus. I began to like math when I took calculus. And when I took organic chemistry as a junior, I really liked that. So I found a couple of fields, and this, I guess, is a lesson for you. You can get somebody that really doesn't seem very interested, and you just never know when they'll find something they're interested in. I know my wife has said this many times. She just sort of muddled through college. She thought she was going to be a doctor, a medical doctor. So she was, you know, kind of going through school, and then she got into class when she was a senior. Is that right, honey? And she thought, man, this is it. And that was biochemistry. And she just loved biochemistry. So you just never know when something will click with somebody. So that's what happened.
And who has the most graduate hours, you or Lynn?
Probably Lynn. I don't know. I never tried to evaluate who has the most.
Someone else?
Oh, I failed to mention one thing. When I was at Arkansas State, my first year there, I didn't mention this and had a big impact on my life. I discovered a book of the Bible that fascinated me, and that's Job. It made me very depressed. I have struggled with depression, and that was probably the first time I ever got really depressed. A couple of things hit me. One is, I'm finished with school. I'd finished my postdoc. I'm finished with school, and so I'll be doing this the rest of my life. And it wasn't that exciting, teaching chemistry. A bunch of people didn't want to be there. And, Job just got me to wondering if life's really worth living. And I began to struggle with depression. And off and on, I have had to struggle with it ever since. I didn't mention another thing that might be informative. About 1981, I went in for my usual checkup at the doctor's, and I had high blood pressure. Runs in my family. So he gave me a beta blocker. And I began to feel kind of bad. I wasn't sure there was any relation. Lynn said something that should have just set off alarm bells. She said, your personality's changing. And so I went to my doctor and I said, I think this high blood pressure medication is messing up my mind. He said, oh no, it doesn't have any side effects. It's been tested. Here comes Big Farm, folks. It's been tested by our pharmaceutical company. I can give you the spiel here. It's been tested many times with many people by our pharmaceutical companies and found to be completely absent of side effects. I said, well, it's bothering me. Well, you're just depressed. Which I probably was, since I fought it all the time. So he gave me an antidepressant. It was one of those old tricyclics. Both of these drugs are now off the market because of side effects. But if I wasn't messed up before I took that thing, I was really messed up after. So by 1982, I was a mess. And I kept telling him, I said, these things are bad for me. I want off of them. Oh, if you get off of them, you're going to have serious problems. You're going to have a heart attack. You're going to be in a nut house somewhere. So I didn't for a while. Finally, I thought, well, life, it just couldn't be any worse than this. It just couldn't get any worse. So I took both of those and threw them in the trash and started getting better at once, almost immediately. But it took years before I recovered. I think that high blood pressure medication was really bad. It took years before I recovered from that.
Besides that episode, is there anything in all of your travels you would have changed?
I think what do you mean by change?
Oh, just you took a fork in the road, like coming to LCU or working on another degree, or all the different kind of choices you made. Is there somewhere that you thought, if I went back, I'd love to change this?
Yeah, if I could change something, I'd go back to elementary school, and I would give myself a teacher with some compassion who would listen to me instead of try to cram arithmetic down my throat. And find out what I'm really interested in and what would motivate me. My teachers could have, I was a latchkey kid. Both my parents taught, and I would show up at home when it got dark, if you were lucky. And other than that, I was never at home, unless the weather was really bad. And I was never around adults. School, you're separated from adults. Church, of course, you're separated from adults. I never had any mature person who was interested in me, who was wise and knowledgeable and could give me some good guidance. Never. And so if I had to do over again, I would go back and put some adults into my life that I could relate to.
That's important.
And I think a lot of our kids, they come from homes that are very fractured. Schools still are very much adults against the children and children against adults. I imagine all this testing stuff has made it even worse. But you could have motivated me. I mean, I'd have learned arithmetic in a day if you'd have just told me, Harry, learn this and you don't have to come to school. If you'd have told me that, I'd have burned up the books. Anything to stay away from that place. But my mother, trying to get rid of me, I guess, enrolled me in school when I was 5. Started the first grade when I was 5. I was tiny anyway, and so even the girls beat me up. Having to be there with the other students was a nightmare. I hated what we were studying. I hated the teachers. They had no interest in me. Just give me a good licking if I misbehaved or something. It was just a terrible experience. I think if I could change anything, I'd go back and put. And I probably need to say I would come to LCU again. It's been very good for me because this is one of the few places that will tolerate a person that has no major. I have taught math. I filled in Greek classes, not officially, but when the teacher was gone, I just filled in for Dr. Martin a few weeks ago. I filled in Greek classes. I have taught chemistry, physics. What have I missed? Oh, psychology. I got a degree in psychology. This is one of the very few places that would tolerate a person like me that can't settle down on anything. Sneaks off to play golf as soon as he can.
Did you get a degree in chemistry and math both as hard?
I did not. I could have picked either one, but I didn't have enough hours for both. Really? And so I ended up taking...
you mean Pittner couldn't get you to major in math?
Well, I could have majored in math, but I couldn't major in both of them. So I ended up picking chemistry because I made higher in the GRE.
And were you in Harding Academy all your life?
Yes, I started in the 3rd grade.
Oh, but you weren't there when you started at age 5?
No, I was at Memphis, Tennessee.
Memphis, but they had an academy there too, didn't there?
Not then, they did not. I started at Voluntein School, which was a public school. Really horrible experience.
So that preference test, did you lie on it?
No, I
Just checking.
no. I answered as honest as I could, but
It just couldn't figure you out.
they couldn't figure me out.
Well,
Yes.
Your house that was disappearing, and the epistemological question, was it there before we got there? Bearing that and your love of philosophy in mind, you didn't like math at one point, and then you discovered calculus, and you discovered a love for math. How do you translate that to your students that are similar minded, the ones that have been taught math as rote and it's a series of rules and they don't like that rigidity, but the ones that later on that are philosophical minded might discover, hey, this isn't so bad after all?
That's a real good question and a very difficult question, I think. I try to get them excited by showing them what excited me, and it almost never works.
Amen.
And I don't know what it is, but you need to probe, and I guess that's the lesson for us. You need to probe what people are interested in, and don't assume just because I think I'll major in history. Oh, you must like history. Oh no, but I got to do something. Probe and try to figure out what they like and what they, because in calculus it fascinated me. Help me say this right, David. But when I learned that in calculus we evaluate rates by dividing by 0. But you can't divide by 0. Well, that fascinates me. How do we do that? Well, it's a limit. We find a limit. What do you mean you find the limit? And sometimes I explain it this way to my students. All of you know what the limit is for this number. You know the limit. But you can't explain how you know exactly. It's just fascinating. What is the limit for this number? 0.3333. I point as a decimal. Decimal 33333. What's the limit?
Keep going forever.
The limit's
1/3.
1/3. The limit is 1/3.
Sam on that.
And if you've ever tried to take 1 and divide by 3, you know what you get. So you know the limit, but anyway, that just fascinates me. Integration fascinates me.
Yeah, I remember my calculus instructor, Dr. Priest, saying you really can't say that you're getting an answer here by canceling out zero in the beginning.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to figure out what he was saying. But that's really right. We are speak with forked tongue in calculus. We tell them you can't divide by zero, and then we turn around and do it.
And you know, it's interesting that during Newton's time, you know, I can't say his name, but that guy that was a bishop in the Anglican Church jerked all over Newton for dividing by zero, and God wouldn't like that. And I'm serious. He wrote a pamphlet excoriating Newton for dividing by zero.
Do you still read philosophy? And I know you don't read novels. Is that right?
I don't care much for novels.
But do you still read philosophy and Kierkegaard?
I've kind of got away from that, and I don't think there's much value, so I kind of left it alone. I've tried to leave it alone, and I spend most of my time, if I have that turn of mind, studying Greek and the New Testament, and I've been sitting in on Dr. Martin's third-year Greek class at a good review. I can't understand why Lynn won't go with me, but she just doesn't seem to want to learn Greek.
Were there philosophy classes at Harding when you were there? Did you take any, or you?
I didn't know there was such a thing. See, and this is where somebody, an adult advisor, could have really helped me. I didn't know they taught Greek. I didn't know I was interested. Well, I liked the Iliad and I liked Greek culture. I might have realized it. I certainly didn't know there were philosophy classes. If I did, I didn't know what they were. See, this is how do you find out if a person is interested in something when they never even seen it? That's kind of a problem I had when I started college, and I think a lot of our students probably. And so I try to overcome this, and I want to encourage you to, if they say, I'm interested in being a doctor. Oh, have you worked in a hospital? Well, no. Well, how you know you like being a doctor? Well, they make a lot of money. Well, wait a minute. Let's talk about this. I hope you probe and get familiar with students. Students so badly need friends. I mean, real friends that can give them some advice. I didn't have one when I graduated from graduate school. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And it would have helped me so much if I had had a good mentor. It took me a long time to realize, even though I had highly trained in the area of research, I'm not a research person. Now, I'll go in the lab, you give me a problem, and say, we want a solution to this, and we want it quick. Oh, man, that motivates me. I'll run in the lab, I'll tackle it. You say, now you need to get a grant and start a research program and get you some students, and you got this thing that just goes on forever and ever, and you write 500 papers, none of which tell you anything. They're just gobbledygook because you got to publish. Oh, come on. I just can't do it. Most research papers to me are just worthless. I'm sorry, but yes.
Aren't you originally from Lubbock, and what took you from Lubbock to there to back?
When I was born, my father was a football coach in Haskell, Texas. And I imagine Haskell's idea of a hospital was probably a tent somewhere that they would put up in case they needed a berth. But my mother came to Lubbock to have me, and I was born at Old West Texas Hospital in 1938. Dad was fired as a football coach shortly thereafter. And I guess we had to move in with my grandparents. My grandfather was preaching at Broadway at the time, G.C. Brewer, some of you might remember. I guess we had to move in with them since Dad was fired. And Mother got a job teaching at Whiteface, and that's the earliest memory of my life, going to Whiteface school with her. I couldn't have been more than 3 or 4. Then he enrolled in the World War II started, and he went in the Air Force. That started at Reese Air Force Base, and some of the earliest memories are him out at Reese. It's kind of interesting because I had physical therapy on my heel a few weeks ago, and I met a fellow who's 91, and he was a guard during that time, and so I went by him, I'm sure, going in and out of Reese, going through the security check. I probably met him, but of course I was only 4 or 5.
Well, thanks, Perry.
You bet.
Great.
You bet.